Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to our second CEO chat. We had our first one in January, and that was with me as the new president of Minnesota Council on Foundations. These CEO chats are really aimed at helping you get to know some of the different leaders at the foundations that are part of the Minnesota Council on Foundations. And so we opened these up to everyone, nonprofits, foundations, others in the community, just to get to know the leadership of these different foundations. So really welcome all of you here. Um, we will start by, I will be asking some questions of Bilal and Migdalia, and you will have time to ask questions as well. You can always feel free to put your questions in the chat or use the Q&A. We will also have some opportunity if you do want to come off mute and ask them a question yourself. You're more than welcome to do that. So really excited to be welcoming Bilal and Migdalia. So I just want to get started here by having Bilal and Migdalia kind of do a brief introduction of themselves.
Yes. Hi, all. Thanks, Michelle. I'll start off. I'm Bilal Alkatout. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm co-executive director of Headwaters Foundation for Justice with Migdalia here. A little just about myself. I'm a queer Palestinian, raised in a Muslim household. I've been in Minnesota nearly all my life. I came here as a war asylum seeker in 1990 with my immediate family, and we've been really in the metro area for since then. So I consider myself another identity of mine as a Minneapolite and a Minnesotan through and through and through.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Migdalia Loyola Meléndez, and I am the other co-AD at Headwaters Foundation for Justice. I, too, have lived in Minnesota a very long time, although I did grow up in Puerto Rico until moving here in my teen years. Minneapolis is also a place I consider home. You may use she, ella, and they for pronouns. And I just told you I'm from Puerto Rico. I identify also as a queer Puerto Rican and proud, more specifically, South Minneapolitan.
Nice.
Yes, we have a lot to be proud of, I think, of just the way our city shows up for people. So, you are both co-executive directors of the Headwaters Foundation for Justice, which I think is a really interesting model and haven't seen that a lot in other foundations or organizations overall. And so I think everyone here is really curious to learn more about this. But before we kind of get to that, you did a brief introduction of yourselves, but I know both of you actually from previous roles, when I was at the Women's Foundation, when I was on the board of the Coalition of Asian American Leaders. And so I know that both of you have very diverse experiences that you bring to the table when it comes to being co-executive directors at Headwaters. So I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit about your journey and how you ended up at Headwaters. I'm sure, there are lots of curves and different experiences that you've had that contribute to what you bring to Headwaters.
You started this time. So, how did I end up at Headwaters? I think it's a question sometimes even I ask myself. One thing that I know often people wonder, ask about, and in fact, I still get that question all the time: how does one end up in philanthropy more generally? And I would say that if there's a current that defines how I present myself in this space and why this space of Headwaters makes sense to me in philanthropy right now, is my career and my experiences have really focused on community center work and communities and centering the voices of community. I have spent most of my time, most of my work time, working at Planned Parenthood in the Department of Education and Outreach. By the time I left Planned Parenthood North Central, which was Planned Parenthood North Central States at the time, the education department spanned North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa. So I was working with people doing community education and outreach for Planned Parenthood across 4 states. And that was a very exciting time. I also worked at Blue Cross in their Center for Prevention, which is the closest I was to philanthropy prior to the experience here at Headwaters. The thing about the center is not the foundation of Blue Cross. However, the center does have contracts that function like grants to community organizations doing small policy and big policy work to affect change in public health. And that was, we had community advisory groups that helped select those contracts that were going out into community groups. And so that's another experience that also informed why I wanted to be a part of Headwaters. And some of you may know me most recently from the time that I spent at the governor's office with Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan leading their public engagement department. And that moment was a really crucial, important one for me when there was the opportunity to create, develop, and put into action the state's first ever public engagement department at a governor's office, and the impact that that action could have for the lives of many Minnesotans. In many ways, that journey and what brings me to Headwaters is all very interconnected because the work we were doing in community, with community organizations, with many groups that are funded by Headwaters advocating for change in our state are the same kinds of groups that I was working with in the governor's office. So those are some of the spaces I would say that contribute to my time here. It's truly an honor to be in co-leadership, and it's also a vocation to be able to center the work that I do in a way that community voices are informing the work that I lead.
Love that story. Um, I've been in philanthropy for quite some time. I actually can thank Minnesota Council on Foundations for a little bit of a entry ramp into philanthropy, but my background is in public health. I started in the sciences and worked in NGO and then nonprofit public health organizations in the Twin Cities. While I was at Wellshare International, which was the last gig before going into philanthropy, I was extremely frustrated with the funding and the restrictions that were coming from government and foundations that, despite working directly with community organizers, community health workers, I couldn't implement the work that was being suggested by the very people that were seeing the issues, firsthand in their communities. And then a colleague said, have you heard of the Ron McKinley Philanthropy Fellowship? It is intended to diversify perspectives in philanthropy. You could be a really great candidate to do just that, be a different perspective, and bring that insight into philanthropy. And so I did, and that was my segue in. I had essentially a fellowship residency kind of at the Bush Foundation, became a program officer or program manager at the Bush Foundation. That evolved into me tapping back into my public health roots and becoming a program officer at Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation. And all the while I was, Headwaters was also a foundation that had a fellow here, Allison Johnson Heist. And I was watching Allison build the programming at Headwaters and hearing the philosophy of Headwaters. And in that time, I joined the finance committee. I was on the board of Headwaters. And when there was a position to come in as a program director, I moved from Blue Cross Blue Shield to be a program director here at Headwaters. And I've been here since 2022. Yeah, April 2022, transitioning into an interim ED, co-ED, and finally landing Migdalia as my co-ED this past June. So this is like my journey in. And I think the fascinating thing that drew me to Headwaters specifically was the people power, was sort of dismantling the power dynamics of money and saying like the people who can make the decisions about their own communities should be making the decisions about how resources are flowing into their communities. And I just saw that as a gold standard here, and it just continually drew me into Headwaters until I was like, here, I'm here and committed to it. So that was my journey.
I think that
Wonderful.
one of the things that Bilal and I have reflected at times is that despite the fact that we came to Headwaters through very different journeys, we also both have in common the public health
Hmm.
component, which might not be a way that people think you end up in philanthropy.
Yeah, that's true. And it's just so important. It is interesting that you both came from that background and have that as part of, your history and experience. So yeah, so let's get into the co-leadership model. You said that you started in June, which is not very long, not even a year quite yet.
Mhm.
I think everyone is really interested in both how Headwaters adopted this model, because from my understanding and talking with you, it's not just you as co-executive directors, but you also have a co-leadership model with the board as well,
Yeah.
and the co-chairs. So could you share with us how Headwaters came to adopt this co-leadership model?
Yeah, I can start with a little history because I've been here. The organization has kind of evolved into it even before Migdalia came to join us. And, it was at a point in 2022 when there was a lot of, I would say, nonprofit inflection point really in the whole sector, where there were a lot of transitions happening. And there were just a lot of questions about power and dynamics in organizations that folks were bringing forward. And I think one of the pieces that really, as we were having conversations with staff and talking about, the role of a philanthropic organization in a social change sector and what it meant, there was a real ask to do as our grantees in order to reinforce our grantees to do what they do best, right? Like, how can we hold a standard for the money that we're distributing and saying, like, advocating for a distribution of power and resources when we haven't done the depth of sort of that analysis in our organization. And that's where our journey started. Um, and so we did a lot of asking questions really about the structure of our organization, even asking, do we want to be a fully flat organization and have everybody be, right, a co-leader? And there are so many different models out there. And so I was really happy at that time to be an interim ED that could step away and have conversations with the staff to see how do we want power dynamics, which are always going to be there in different ways, whether it's positionality or whether it's identity or whatever it is, age, tenure. Power shows up in really different ways at different times. But how do we want the power structures or dynamics to be? And we prioritized shared leadership as a place where we could sort of grow more democratic decision making at the top of the organization to trickle down into the organization. We could uplift um, uh, 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 well, we could sort of avoid some pitfalls of like burnout for singular leadership that we've seen and heard even in our
Mhm.
own organization. And we can, what was the last thing? Burnout, shared decision making, and I forget. There was one more value proposition too that I'm blanking on. But that's kind of how we got to as a group deciding that this organization would have co-leadership at the helm, and hopefully trickle down those values into the rest of the structure.
Mhm.
And that's how it was adopted. And as a model that we've had in the organization too in the past with co-program directors. When I came in, I was a shared program director role. And we also had co-chairs and currently have co-leadership on our Giving Project program, where we have two managers that are
Mhm.
running that and co-facilitating that program. So yeah, that's kind of how we got to the decision to have that shared leadership.
I think if people want to see or learn more about the process in our website and the Headwaters Foundation website, we have blogs that tell a little bit more about the journey and how we got to this place and why shared leadership became such an important tool and resource that Headwaters shows to exemplify and live our values.
Oh, I remember the third thing, isolation,
Oh, yes.
Mm.
the feeling of isolation.
Mhm.
So there's almost, right, there's like automatic companionship at the helm of the organization.
That's wonderful. Yeah, because I think those are all really good points. We hear that a lot from nonprofits, foundations, organizations, both the isolation that you might feel when you're in a leadership position like that and the burnout, being
Mhm.
able to share those responsibilities. So, kind of my next question is getting to kind of the nuts and bolts. Like, how does this co-leadership model work? How do you split responsibilities and who does what? Could you explain kind of that a bit more?
Yeah. One thing that I would also add, which is maybe implied in what Bilal just spoke about, is that I have seen co-leadership models in other spaces I've been in. And one of the reasons I think in the past 7 months this has been successful is because of that thoughtfulness and that intentionality that Bilal described. So some of the things I will talk about how it's looking like in real time, I I think are a product of that intentionality and that thoughtfulness that has gone into the process. And one thing I would say, because we are we are really setting this up, right? The board and the staff and the people who surround the community of Headwaters explore ideas about how to move forward. Shared leadership became the a model that we wanted to follow. And we also are clear that in order for us to get to the place in which that model is living up to our expectations and our values, also it's going to require some testing, trying out things, and maybe learning and recalibrating as needed. So I'm sharing that saying just to say that what works for us may not work for everyone, but I think that in that interest of co-learning as well as co-leading, we are very invested and interested in evaluating how it's working and retooling and recalibrating as needed. So one of the things that I have really appreciated about the way in which the model is working is that we have set aside time to work with individual coaches, so executive coaches for Bilal, executive coach for me, but then also we have a co-leadership coach with whom we work together, and with whom we're able to formulate our joint vision, our joint agreements, our joint values, and how they guide the work that we do together, really from that value and heart perspective. That's important. And it's also important to think about what that looks like in real life. And so the way in which we have divided our work and try to think about the task at hand is not in a way that says, Bilal is taking care of only these parts of the organization and Migdalia is taking care of only these parts of the organization. But really, we're thinking about it in terms of who is primary in an area and maybe getting more in the weeds in that area and who's secondary. And that to us was really important, because, as you heard, one of the goals of co-leadership was to reduce isolation. And we felt that if you completely divide tasks and then now you have two people leading completely separate areas where the other person does not have as much expertise or as much investment in, there might still be isolation, right? So the primary secondary model allows both of us to be involved in the strategic conversations for any part of the organization, respecting and valuing the ability of the other to go deeper into the details in their primary area, but also being involved enough that if one of us is either on a planned vacation or out sick or any other reason not able to be around, the other person still knows enough and is able to step in enough that none of us has to feel like we're not able to do that, that we don't have to feel isolated, and that our leadership does not have to lead to burnout. And so we worked to develop that over the first few months we were together. And then in October, November, we shared this model with the board and the staff. And then we also told people that because it's pretty new and, we hadn't tried this out yet, that about a 6-month point, which we're going to reach soon, we haven't reached yet, we will check to see what's working, what's not working with that, what tweaks we would want to do. We also would self-evaluate on our own and also with the support of our co-leadership coach. And so I would say from my perspective, it's working out pretty well to be clear on those things. And when we have found places where we did not think ahead of time, to connect on how does this work in this model, one of the things that then works really well, because we started the conversation not with those technical details, but with the values that guide us, it has been very natural and very easy to say, we had not thought about this. I'm noticing that we did not discuss how this should play out.
Mhm.
And then because we're guided by those co-leadership values we set together, it's much more natural to say, okay, how do we overcome that? How do we address that moving forward? Guided by those values, even if the technical pieces or the tactical pieces were not resolved or thought about from the beginning.
Yeah, I would reiterate like a celebration of the intention even after starting of like what I'll reiterate this. It was not a mission of the organization. It was not values of the organization. Migdalia and I sat together and
Yes.
created our shared leadership mission and our shared leadership values, and then discussed how do we integrate that into our work. And sometimes it's like truly as simple as Wednesday feels, where we're going to share joy, because joy and including of joy very regularly or celebration regularly in our work was something that we both expressed as being a really important factor in feeling like an effective leader, right? That might not have surfaced for other leaders in that same way, or we could use other tools to use that. But even just that example of taking like 15 minutes a week, we will spend a minimum of 15 minutes a week celebrating something that we've accomplished as an organization or individuals. And that's going to be reinforcing of our leadership in the organization. And that's unique to us, right? And even unique to our staff, but sharing that that's something that we're doing with our staff and with each other. And right, maybe there's a need for more eventually, but that's where the feedback comes back into play, to say we're probably implementing and not getting it perfectly, but it can be an evolving thing. And I wanted to I wanted to reinforce another thing Migdalia said too, which was um, the intentionality and planning too, right? Those pieces that I shared about isolation and burnout and demonstrating, shared decision making. The other side of that was uh, compromising something else that we just didn't want to prioritize, right? We were prioritizing these values. So maybe there's a compromise of speed in decision making because there's two of us that have to discuss something to move it forward, right? Or maybe you can have a strong communication from one figurehead that's sort of communicating out or something, right? Like that's compromise because there's a co-leadership. But the values that we wanted to instill were these shared leadership, lack of isolation and burnout. So that was our priorities, again, unique to our organization. It could be different for others.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I love especially the Wednesday feels. I think that's great and unique to your particular combination of co-leadership. Are there other things that you would say, I know it hasn't even been a year yet, but that you have been finding are the most valuable parts of this model for the both of you?
One thing that I would add, the building in time to celebrate and build trust and connection with each other, since we have, by the inherent nature of our work, to be work together and in alignment with each other, is that people may think, oh, so you can get twice as much done. However, we're often like today here together. And so it's not really possible to think about the work as being a times two. But what you're thinking about is, even in the spaces when we're together, is the potentiality of two different approaches, two different mindsets, two different perspectives, and how those enrich the conversation and enrich the outcome. not just about the output of how many more hours of work are being put in. And so I've so many places in which I have already found myself in settings in which it's been really helpful to have Bilal's perspective and ideas that maybe help me refocus my lens on an issue or a question or a problem at hand. Where maybe if I was just me by myself, of course, I would try to surround myself with staff and colleagues that also can help me see things differently and help me learn. But it's also very, very fulfilling to be able to work with someone who is a strategic partner who can also bring that perspective at that level as of an equal partner. So I would say that's one way that I would see that as different.
Yeah.
That maybe people think, oh, now you get two EDs, but it's not really two EDs. It's really like maybe a super ED.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that's right. I, in another way to say it, it's like, and I felt this, right? Having stood in the organization alone for some time, there is a transition to a team leading the organization versus the burden of that kind of
Hmm.
fitting on me. So if you think of, oh, such a privilege to run this organization, and it does feel like a burden to run an organization and be at the helm of an organization. I'm so thankful for such like ambitious and capable staff. And there is so much of that accountability that falls on our roles. And I think a similar and different perspective is even when Migdalia had started, um, an external analysis of what an organization with shared leadership could be, because everything we had was in concept and in writing. And we had already actually been practicing some singular leadership practices, right? And even I've had, by default, even just like was taking on a singular leader role and activities and decision making. And so unlearning some of that has been, both challenging and inspiring, I think, in our work because it's really just transformed some of the way that we do things to actually fit into the shared leadership, um, in a way that even in theory we couldn't practice until it was implemented, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it seems like you kind of learn as you're doing,
For
and
sure.
iterate and especially with the feedback that you're hearing. But I love this. I mean, I think it's sort of like two brains are better than one, in this type of model.
Yeah.
And you started to talk about this a little bit, but let's dig into it a little bit more. What are the areas of this model that you're still working on or that you're still trying to figure out? Because I know that you're iterating and, getting feedback. Are there certain areas that are challenging about this model that you've needed to work through or you're still trying to think about?
Hmm. Well, I started to talk a little bit about this one that maybe outside people or maybe even our own colleagues or their own board may have an expectation that because there's two of us,
Hmm.
things can happen twice as fast. Or um, yeah, that somehow it's like multiplying in a way that it doesn't really multiply. The effect comes from a different space, and or from a different that dual leadership doesn't necessarily mean it means additional hours, yes, but it's not the only outcome. I think that's
Hmm.
sometimes the challenge of learning what that is, and even trying to have conversations about the spaces in which it makes the most sense for us to be together, which there's a lot of spaces where that makes sense for us to show together. The spaces where we are each showing up as the sole co-ed in that space, and what does that mean for what we're bringing back to each other in that strategic thinking. And so I think that we're both very clear about what we mean to do with that. And then we also, have to still develop, I think, the ways in which we can, I call it the catch up, especially in the places where we're both not together. Because it might be really hard to predict, what does Bilal want to know about the meeting that I attended? And frankly, as a human, you have two needs. There's like, what does Bilal need to know about the meeting? And there might also be like, what does Migdalia need to unload about the meeting? And
Yeah.
those two things might be the same and they might not be the same. Um, but then that's also the benefit of having a co-AD that maybe you can do both. You have a person that you can be like, oh, this happened, and was this the right response? Was it the right approach? What would you have done? That's maybe the unloading. And there's also like, these were the next steps. This is what you should know about the next meeting in case I'm not there. So that we can do both. But retooling that every time, I think we still are like sometimes like, oh, I forgot to tell you that.
Yeah.
Right? Like figuring out the best way to do that each time can be at times not impossible. It can be clunky, I was gonna
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
in a good way.
Yeah. I mean, I'm surprised at the not tremendous
Yeah,
answer
yeah,
that I
yeah.
have for this,
Love it.
which is great. I mean, I'll step back maybe a little bit because I think your questions are going to get into this, but I like for a social justice foundation, really run by community, committees and a community board in this like great inflection point, like we're going through uncharted territory as
Mhm,
any leader right now of an
mhm,
organization, and we're doing co-leadership. And so when I hear like, am I decompressing or getting advice? I'm like, we're in a good place where like that's our biggest sort of hurdles because we're also having conversations, as many are about what is the risk to our community? What is the risk to our grantees? How do we support those organizations? How
mhm,
are we at risk because of that very risk in this
mhm,
moment? And those are just difficult questions. And I would say, I'm so thankful that I'm not alone in navigating that uncharted
mhm,
territory because, wow, I can only imagine how even more isolating and even more of a burnout there would be if I was trying to navigate that alone. So I will just say that, like, to say like those questions and those conversations about risk and safety right now are hard questions, and it's like a good and difficult to have to like navigate those, and
and they're easier to navigate
they're
together.
easier to
Yeah, for
navigate
sure.
together.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that's been the difficulty, is
Mhm,
just being like, how do we do this? But also
mhm,
knowing like neither of us have the answers, but we
mhm,
kind of got each other's backs and trying to
mhm,
navigate the moment
mhm,
is just a
mhm.
difficulty that exists. I don't think that's about the shared leadership, but it's just a real thing about leadership right now, I
Mm.
guess.
hmm Definitely.
Yeah, yeah. I will just, I mean, just to really add to what Bilal has said, I do think that, I mean, that goes hand in hand with what I was saying, because while there might be some additional time that's built in that, if you have an idea or approach you want to proceed that's very strategic at the level that rises above the primary, secondary ways in which we divide our work, then that touch point is really important. But then on the like what that means is that I am really witnessing for ourselves that because we have that built in, the isolation is less of a thing that we feel as leaders, because again, we're here together, and then we can be like, I have this idea or I encountered this, and we can be a sounding board for each other, even as we're trying to figure out the best way to be a sounding board for each other, is what I was saying. Like
Yeah,
sometimes it's like, oh, I forgot to say this or I forgot to mention that. And we're both very open and curious and learning. And I cannot complain about the fact that we actually, because we have each other and we don't have to do it on our own.
yeah,
hmm Yeah. It's like building a plane in the air, but at least you have each other to build it. You're not building it
Yes,
by yourself.
yes,
yes, agreed.
I like that.
Um, so you were talking about this moment. We're definitely going to get into that more, but kind of, there's some people here who are familiar with the work that Headwaters does, others who are not as familiar. So would really like to just ground us in, from my understanding, Headwaters really focuses on resourcing movement organizations.
Yeah.
And this is an area that I don't think a lot of foundations are either investing in or aware of as much. So could you start with just some examples of movement work that you've been supporting as a foundation?
Yeah. It's Headwaters has existed for 40 years, so I'll set that as a kind of anchor to the conversation a little bit. And, started out of the ACT UP movement, gender rights movements in the 80s, the Native American movements as they emerged. So we have had this history of mobilizing resources and being sort of comrades to various grassroots efforts that have like had momentum, not had momentum in the advocacy for social justice and rights. Um, right now, I was thinking about Unidos, who's been doing tremendous organizing and just makes a case for the focus on civic participation, civic engagement, right? I think it's really important to like flesh out what mobilizing like a movement organizing, movement building and organizing looks like, because it happens at really different levels, even to the point of policy advocacy, right on the ground organizing, door knocking, things like that. And um, we have like created this ecosystem that brought us to this like showcase of how mutual aid can come and be resourced and mobilized, and how organizers can mobilize. And Unidos comes to mind because they've been doing so much of the training for observers, organizing around immigrant rights, and has been a longstanding organization that we have funded and partnered with. But what I want to reinforce is the thriving sort of ecosystem, like similar to Unidos, Headwaters has been funding these movements and these organizers, was funding in the moment, is funding in the moment, and will continue to fund throughout. So I'll look back at, even though there's tremendous hard work and exemplary mobilizing that's happening at Unidos, um, they were they were integral in like driver's license reform. They have been integral in working with students and the Dreamers and the movement of Dreamers. They are yeah, they have been really at the center of immigrant organizing, and they're a part of a collaborative that's called Tending the Soil. And if Headwaters wasn't one of the first funders of Tending the Soil, it was one of the very first funders of Tending the Soil, which is this collaborative of organizations that is made up of Saytool, uh, uh, United Renters for United Renters for Justice, the New Justice project, New Justice focusing on democracy building and civic engagement, right? The Renters for Justice focusing on organizing renters and renters' rights, cooperative housing, housing interventions. Saytool focused on worker organizers, has been organizing construction workers and things like that. They are, along with a union, SIEU unions, they've been working towards building the Rise Up Center and have this vision for the intersection, right, of the right to livelihood, basically, the right to civic engagement, the right for fair work, the right for fair housing. They take on these issue specific approaches, but they recognize that these are all intersectional and that these need to be addressed in an intersectional way. And they have this big, ambitious, thriving vision for their community, and they've had it and they've been working towards it. And so, as beautiful as it's been to reinforce some of the organizing in a galvanizing moment, it is so important to not put these organizers in a position to be or have to be scrappy or have to be you know positioned as like a grassroots means low resource position because they have such big, huge vision for what a social change ecosystem and what agency and livelihood and self-determination can look like in our communities. So yeah, that's kind of that's I think Headwaters in a nutshell too, is like we have been here reinforcing those visions and we are here in the moment and are well positioned in the moment and will continue to be reinforcing. And I don't want to take too much time, but I think it's also worth noting, the metropolitan urban Indian directors also being a place that is a collective of Native directors that was organizing and standing up protectors, people, eliciting people in their communities as protectors through the uprisings in 2020. And I think we're one of many sparks of nonviolent protest, right? That people can stand and be protecting of their community and community members. They were also integral in, organizing around housing and the Wall of Forgotten Natives. And all of that is in the name of, protecting and building for 7 generations ahead, right? And so there's this big successes in housing and infrastructure in their indigenous cultural corridor that is alive in a moment, but is continual, before and after those galvanizing moments. And that's sort of the bigger vision that I would say we have, and I would kind of like love more philanthropic momentum to be kind of
Mhm.
connected to us too. Yeah, I wanted to name those as examples.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and that leads to my next question. You've been investing in these movements for 40 years, and that's really helped plant the seeds. And we are seeing the effects of that early investment now here in this moment. And you mentioned it's been such a pivotal moment here in Minnesota. I know that the two of you wrote an op-ed for Inside Philanthropy. I'll put the link here for people to read if they haven't seen it yet, where you share some learning and maintaining this focus on movements. And also there's a call, to other foundations, organizations, individuals to support this kind of movement work. What are some of the learnings and some of the things that you captured in this op-ed, but maybe even some of the things that you weren't able to put into this op-ed? Oh, you're on mute.
I don't even know how we muted ourselves. So here we are. Okay, so I thank you for sharing the article, and thank you because I was going to mention that we try as we are navigating this moment. There's a few things that I would add that I would say reinforce what you're saying, Michelle, reinforce what Bilal was saying. So the first thing is that one of the things that Headwaters in our approach over the past 40 years and how that approach has evolved is that in philanthropy, we do not see ourselves as separate from the plight of the community organizations that we're funding. We know that their own liberation, their own quest for social justice impact us as well. And so we we see that as when we talk about the ecosystem, yes, we're a funder, but we're also part of that ecosystem that helps us achieve a thriving, inclusive and equitable society. Um, so that's the first thing I would say. And that's, I would say in our article that it was in Inside Philanthropy, one of the things we're trying to say is that creating these barriers or creating ways in which we see ourselves in philanthropy as separate from those outcomes or as somehow not needing to take on the risks that communities are taking to achieve those great gains that are going to have sweeping improvements for our livelihoods is it's short-sighted in some ways, right? So we want to make sure that when we're thinking about how people achieve are able to get food on the table, yes, there's necessities right now to, in some cases, mutual aid, in some cases, food shelves, in some cases, churches. And as we get food in people's table, then the next question is, Why are there not livable wages that make it possible for people to get this food on their own? And so these examples that Bilal was referring to, where there's unions and organizers coming together for long-term solutions that actually will ensure that maybe the food shelf is not needed because we have livelihoods that are able to support ourselves, feeding ourselves, and our communities being whole. And those are also important things to invest in. And we cannot invest in them only in the crisis because, again, we are all in this together. We all form part of the same ecosystem. And it's going to be important that those efforts are also resourced as they're being planned outside of a crisis. And so anyway, so that's the first thing I would say, and that's the invitation that we're making in this article, is that we see ourselves as being able to uphold and sustain those efforts that lead to long-term change for our communities. Not taking away from the things that people need immediately. Yes, that's needed, and it's also needed to imagine and create the future we want to see, where those Band-Aids efforts are not the only way we have to support our ourselves and our communities and our families. The other thing I would add is that because we saw and we saw not because we were smarter than anybody else, but because we're grounded in community, and community and our grantees and people in our ecosystem told us we should be thinking about something like, how do we do a rapid response fund? And so we started to do a rapid response cycle that functions almost every month. There's a few months when we don't have it going, but we started in July of 2025, trying to make it transparent and easy for people to obtain funds, knowing that the moments of crisis and what a crisis and a moment of pivoting for organizations and communities may change from month to month, that we had that available throughout the year. And so we are now in the midst of our cycle 5 of those. And we have seen throughout time how different things have emerged. But that rapid response doesn't occur in isolation. We have that at the same time that we have our fund for the Sacred Circle and our Justice and Liberation funds that sustain longer term commitments that are not only in the emergency or in the crisis moment. So really striving to balance how we are supporting our ecosystem for responding to a crisis while also supporting the long-term work. And the supporting the long-term work, the last thing I will say about that is about the resources and the funds, but also about creating that community and providing what we call the support beyond the dollars, which is the capacity building and the networking and the other pieces that can also support our ecosystem and help it thrive as people learn from each other, honing their skills that make them more efficient, learn from each other, maybe have opportunities to get to know organizations and other leaders that can advance the causes they're working on. So we think of ourselves in the ecosystem as being able to play this role that supports all those things. And the way I see it, I think of it also, it's like us as philanthropy is made up of all the people who contribute to Headwaters, because it is a community foundation. So each of us who form part of this community is also part of making the change. Whether we are, giving $10 or $1,000 or more, $2,500, but also if you are one of the organizations in the ecosystem that is helping create the future we want to see for each other.
Thank you so much. I have kind of one last question for you, but wanted to say that everyone should feel free to put your questions in the chat, the questions you have for Bilal and Migdalia, or prepare to come off mute and ask your question yourself if you wish. So I'll just ask this last question, but go ahead and put your questions in the chat or prep for that. So my last question is kind of related to what you were saying, Migdalia, and it's really the article, and just really appreciate you pointing out, yes, a need to be met, and people are really focused on that right now, but don't forget about the long term, planting those seeds so that we can avoid maybe some of these problems, these acute problems that we've had in the future. Thinking about housing and thinking about things like that, or food. Um, what are other ways that foundations, organizations, individuals can do to support Headwaters and to support this movement building here in our state?
Well, I think I will explicitly say more and more, um, we've been working to partner with institutional funders to be an intermediary type organization that has like different types of connotations, but we've built something that's really well positioned to have a good reputation, trust, and community power, resourcing community power. And I think partnering with us, I think, is just a great way of unlocking resources that larger institutions just don't really have the capacity to do what we're doing in such a localized way. So just right direct partnering with us. But I think in that longer vision, and I think what we called for and what Migdalia was speaking to is that, you know, ICE attacks and rhetoric that causes Islamophobia and xenophobia and transphobia and all of these things that are moments that violence in our communities, all of these like social galvanizing moments will continue to come and go. And there's also elections that I think when we talk about democracy and civic engagement, it's often around like get out the vote.
Mhm.
And I don't think we can have a really full-fledged democracy when people are only voting or being pushed to vote and participate in midterm or primary elections, and emphasis on the primary elections. And that's when resources flow. So I think the call is to be really explicit about having an agenda for root causes,
Mhm.
right? It's direct action. It's not just civic engagement, because I think that lumps in like or democracy building, because I think that lumps in just an assumption that it's about voter engagement. It's about civic engagement, direct action, community gathering, infrastructure building, policy change, right? Like, how can we be way more explicit about what it looks like to have, organizers and movement builders reinforced in our community? And we're often saying, like, what is our role and how do we build a social change ecosystem for Minnesota? Like, what if change was a constant for the
Mhm.
positive? And what does that look like, and how can we create that ecosystem? So, what would your role be in that ecosystem, and define it? And if it's outside of it, why?
Mhm. Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Layla. Just really interested in Headwaters' board reception to the idea of co-leading and any advice or thoughts on addressing board concerns. Maybe people who are considering leadership models in their own organizations. Any advice, thoughts about that?
Well, I will let you answer about the historic, like how
Yeah,
historically the
yeah.
board navigated it. But one thing that I would say that it's helpful in our instance here too is that the board also has made the decision for the co-leadership for themselves. So they're also came to the conclusion and model the co-leadership model that then is also adopted by the organization.
And it's challenging, I know, because a lot of folks with trustees and maybe people who are coming from, corporate money that's turned into a foundation or something like that, it's really hard in those traditional systems to justify or verify. I mean, sometimes I'm like, maybe you could sell a president CEO model, right? Like a corporation maybe has something like that, but it was easy. It
Mhm.
was easy for us, but that's because we had community members in our organizations, particularly community organizers or folks who were embedded in community
Mhm.
organizing that had seen examples of dismantling sort of traditional structures and having shared leadership. I keep like reflecting on what we're building, like again, coming back to this idea of democracy, we only have so many exposures to democratic processes actually in our world, and it's not extensive, and it's like really demonstrating of why people don't quite understand what democracy really looks like in action because we engage with it so little. And so I think as we've been like having culture conversations with our board and with our staff, it's been about how do we, have compromises in a more democratic culture? How do we have more shared decision making in a democratic culture? How do we build policy in a democratic culture? And it's like I was sharing, oh, I feel like we're creating a micro democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to actually have a to have a democracy. And there are compromises, and there are things that I think we're not used to in our traditional systems. But our board thankfully came from those grassroots efforts and those models where those have been tested in other spaces. Because what we're doing isn't new.
Mm-mm.
It's new to us. It's pretty new to philanthropy, but in our social justice organizations, it's actually been in existence and tried quite a bit. So I think having the board that's comes from that was really helpful. Is actually kind of easy. So but I hear that in
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
The only thing I would add to that, not having been here when the board was making the deliberations to get to this conclusion, is my observation as the newcomer, is that we have a board that probably not just because of the background, but also because of the work they've done together as a board with the staff and with themselves, is equally committed to the values that we're trying to embody as an organization. And so, that I would say makes them also willing to try models that embody those values that can nurture a culture where equity and inclusion can thrive, where people power can thrive. And so um, I think that is as important is the work that has happened to expand that culture within the organization to how the board itself sees the work and understands what is it that the organization is trying to model and embody, not
Yeah.
just for ourselves, but for our ecosystem.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. If you do have questions you weren't able to ask them during this time, I'm sure Bilal and Migdalia would be happy to follow up with you another
For sure.
time. But let's all find that react button in the chat and just our appreciation for Bilal and Migdalia and really coming and speaking with us today. Thank you so much for sharing about your co-leadership model with us today.
Thanks for having us. This was great.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
And just a little plug, we do have other events coming up for 2026. You can always go to mcf.org/events to see all of our events coming up, including our next CEO chat, which will be on May 14th with Tariq Malik from Securian Financial. So thank you so much, Bilal Migdalia, and I hope you all have a good day.